Good morning, everyone, and welcome to episode 53 of Mestre Vibes podcast. I came into the Academia a little early today as it was recycled trash day. So today I went out and grabbed some bottles that I will be working on this week, so I'll be doing some of that. I'm making my return to upcycling and having a great time doing it. Before I jump into today's podcast topic, I want to say thank you to all of my Patreon community for always supporting and making the podcast possible. In today's podcast, I want to share some reflections I had after my last workshop in Hamamatsu, Japan. Last Sunday, I was invited by Professor Choquito from the Capoeira group Baraúna to do a workshop for his students. I'm very grateful and happy to have gone down there and shared my love and passion of capoeira. As I mentioned before in previous podcasts, it's an unusual experience to go to Hamamatsu or any other area in Japan where there is a large Brazilian population. Here in Tokyo, everything is in Japanese. Once you go to Hamamatsu or other places such as Gunma or Aichi, you start to encounter so many Portuguese signs all over the place. For me, at the end of the day, it was a great opportunity to teach a workshop in Portuguese and to be able to practice what I consider my professional language. I tend to speak English in adult classes in Tokyo, and more I'm speaking English in the kids' classes as well, because it's so important for my students to have the opportunity and the ability to understand English well. The education system here in Japan relies heavily on your ability to write and understand English. So I'm doing my best with my focus on creating a really good cultural community center for my students and for the people around me. Back to my trip. From the moment we got off the train, we felt as though we were no longer in Japan, but in a mini city in Brazil. This time, my wife and one of my junior high school students went with me, and I will share some of their experiences later in the podcast, along with reflections and things they shared with me. Overall, it was a fantastic event, and I feel completely recharged and positive about what I'm doing. More importantly, I'm focused on my role as a mentor. This is something we've been covering in the last few podcasts, and it came to the forefront when we were in Hamamatsu and I was interacting with Professor Choquito. From the moment we got into the van when he picked us up on the way to the workshop space, it was just a fluent and interesting conversation about all things capoeira in Japan, capoeira in his daily life. Let me share a few topics we discussed, and feel free to add any comments you may have. After the workshop, we discussed a lot about acrobatics, and he shared with me a lot of information about his group and how his mestre does things. He shared with me how his group was started, some of the stories of his mestre, and his vision for capoeira here in Japan. According to him, in his group, they don't really rely so much on acrobatic movement, but rather on clean precision movement, primarily focused on high kicks very close to your partner. It was wonderful for him that I was able to do a technical acrobatic workshop for his students. Although there were very few people at the workshop, it was well worth going. The best part of the workshop was that his 3 sons were involved and great at capoeira. I was a little envious since my kids stopped doing capoeira years ago. I guess being raised in something from the day you were born can make it a little overwhelming and not much of a choice. Although my kids did do capoeira from when they were very small up until the end of elementary school, none of my children decided to continue. Of course, I wish they would have, but I'm happy that they have found their own way in doing things and they are chasing their own dreams. All I can do is be the best father I can be and hope to support them in what they do. After I finished the workshop, Professor Choquito and I discussed the importance of acrobatics in capoeira, especially outside of Brazil. Recently, he mentioned to me that he's getting a lot of public demonstrations and a lot of opportunities to present what he does throughout his prefecture. I mentioned to him that in all my travels and interactions in different places around Asia, Europe, and the United States, If you don't have acrobatics, you lack a very powerful tool that is very eye-catching and attracts people to come see what you're doing. In many cases, the first thing that attracts people to come to try capoeira, in my opinion, is the acrobatics. Capoeira acrobatics are a key part of the promotion and attraction to capoeira. I said that if he was interested in getting more students, he might think about incorporating more acrobatics in his classes. He agreed, and I was happy to record a video of my workshop and upload it to YouTube. I will share the link to the 1-hour workshop with my Patreon community. I will share some clips and short videos with the general public, but I'll keep the full workshop private as a special behind the scenes for my Patreon community. If you would like to get access to that, take a look at my Patreon page and get access to everything I do. Professor Choquito isn't a full-time capoeira teacher. He has a regular full-time job in construction, teaches capoeira, and is also a personal trainer on the side. He mentioned to me that his dream is to teach capoeira more, but mentioned a few obstacles that I thought were interesting, and I want to share those with you guys. Although he has lived in Japan for over 7 years, he has almost no ability to speak Japanese. In Hamamatsu, in his daily life, he doesn't need it. I think this isn't a barrier and comes down to more of how he promotes his classes in Portuguese and tries to bring in more Japanese students interested in learning Portuguese. A stable amount of Japanese students would be realistic for him to reach his goal. This is even more important after he said many of the Brazilians in Hamamatsu don't want to pay for capoeira. He said that most of the people who come to Japan from Brazil come for work and are generally lower income levels in Brazil and are here for better opportunities than they had in Brazil. He mentioned that most of the Brazilians who had done some capoeira in Brazil before coming to Japan generally did it in low-income community projects. And in these projects, the teachers were paid by the government, so the students don't have a culture of paying for capoeira. This is something that he felt hindered his ability to grow the financial side of capoeira for him. I told him that wherever you are, there will be people who don't see the value in what you do. And the important thing to do is not to think of them as students or clients, but to remember that the moment he charges, he is providing a service. And if the customers don't pay, then they don't want the service. There is another reason why I advise him to start to think of capoeira in a different light, not only for the Brazilian community, but for the larger community as a whole. I feel that if he can repackage his service, he would be able to draw in a larger audience and community to what he does. When I asked him if he had an image of having his own academy, he smiled and said yes. I mentioned that to do this, you need to provide the maintenance of the academy and your income and the creative plan to attract people who will willingly support and be a healthy part of your community and projects. I was very happy to help him take a moment to reflect on his situation and hopefully clear up some ideas he had. On the way back from Hamamatsu on the train, I asked my wife what she thought. She said it was a wonderful experience and realized how important Portuguese is in the capoeira world. I said she doesn't need to speak Portuguese fluently, but to enjoy what she does and to enjoy capoeira. It's hard because I always get into these conversations with people about how important is it to learn Portuguese in capoeira. I think if you're going to teach capoeira independently, like I did my own group, then you should motivate yourself to learn Portuguese. I've been at events where I've talked to other teachers who do not speak English. The only common language was Portuguese. And at the end of the day, if you want to sit at the mestre's table, you have to speak a level of Portuguese that matches the social dynamic of capoeira. It isn't European Portuguese, but Brazilian capoeira Portuguese. Many times, people will say they speak Portuguese, but it is either academic, too basic, or just direct translations in their heads. I see a lot of that. When people translate in their heads, or I can tell they have no idea what was just said and don't communicate well, that they don't understand. I've been at workshops where the supposedly Portuguese teacher in Asia or the Portuguese speaker completely mistranslates what the mestre or guest says. If you're in capoeira for a long time, you naturally pick up some expressions and develop a basic way to communicate with mestres. But if you're going to teach, then you can take online classes to start. You can put yourself in a learning situation, and you need to open yourself up to learning about Brazilian culture. I know I've said a million times, but after last weekend, it is different when Brazilian culture is involved in capoeira. Who decides what it is and how it comes into play in your life? That's a case-by-case situation. However, I do know that if the situation isn't in a good energy Brazilian cultural style, then I don't feel any axé, any energy. And it's just not interesting for me. Someone asked me once how I developed my Portuguese language skills, but I see now that it's more about how I develop my capoeira Portuguese. Capoeira has its own culture, nuances, and traditions. Capoeira has words and phrases that are unique to capoeira culture. Words like malícia, mandinga, malandragem are not used in everyday Portuguese the way they are used in capoeira. So many times I get questioned by students asking me the meaning of a song because when they used some kind of translation program, it didn't work. Or more than that, the word didn't get recognized. This is because many of the words are turned into slang or used in ungrammatical forms in capoeira, and only people who use them can understand the context. Looking back at old songs and the writing of lyrics, many times they resemble African American Ebonics. For those who don't know, this is a term that refers to the African American way of speaking English, or the best way to explain it as a unique dialect. Growing up, I remember having so many friends who spoke in this fashion. Today, I feel blessed looking back and appreciating all the great opportunities I had. People ask me all the time how many languages I speak. If I answer as a normal person, I would say Japanese, English, Portuguese, and Spanish. If I answer how many language and dialects I speak as a cultural anthropologist, I would say American Ebonics, Standard Brazilian Portuguese, Capoeira Portuguese, Standard International Spanish, Chicano Mexican American language, American English, Standard International English, and so on. So I say this not only because I speak these, but I can culturally identify and talk in the nuances of the language, or the way the language is used in that culture. The best part of the trip was the ride home on the train. If you've never ridden a Japanese bullet train, then get over here and do it. It's so nice and so much fun. The train was pretty crowded with people returning to Tokyo at the end of the weekend, but it was relaxing. My junior high school student was so great. She played a lot of capoeira. She felt the energy, and I feel she will become more inspired. She was so impressed by how the three sons of Professor Choquito played capoeira with him and each other. She recognized the importance of just playing good, clean capoeira. I've mentioned to her and other kids how important it is to play good, clean capoeira. I've watched a lot of videos and had this conversation many times with others. People need to play capoeira to improve. The attack, the defense, the counterattack are all part of developing each person's capoeira skill. Many times I see people playing out of timing with the music, and in my opinion, I see so much crashing as people don't learn to play with each other. This is something I will always be working on with my students because it's so important. If I had to reflect on one point that made the weekend most enjoyable, it was the positivity that Professor Choquito and I shared. In Japan, there are few non-Japanese groups of capoeira. For me, there are few opportunities to interact with positive Brazilian cultural communities in Asia. It doesn't mean that I'm not happy what I do. I'm just saying that the feeling is just a little different. Comment if you have any ideas or opinions on the topic. Again, thank you to my Patreon community for making all of this possible. The link for my workshop video last Sunday is up. Lots of love, lots of peace, and lots of capoeira. Mestre Sukuri, Tokyo, Japan. Mestre Vibes.